Miles Morales and Gwen Stacy got married. Not only that, but they had kids. If you're mostly a fan of Into the Spider-Verse and not a frequent reader of comics, the title and thumbnail for this video almost definitely caught you off guard. Those of you that read comics though know just how crazy things can get, and that just about any and everything you could think of has happened at one time or another. It is true though, Spider-Man Miles Morales did in fact marry and have kids with Gwen Stacy. The story begins with Miles' father, Jefferson Davis, going missing. Before that though, the story begins with some shots of Miles and Gwen making out, making it very clear what the story is about and what is to come. We're given the story through a flashback beginning, with Miles explaining to his friends that he made out with Gwen, and here they kind of act as us, the readers, reflecting our shared disbelief. The flashback begins with Miles on the roof of a building learning of his father's disappearance from his frantic mother via phone call. They were both concerned, but ultimately, Miles would tell her to call the police and hospitals to find out if his father had been hurt. This was the normal thing to do, of course, when someone goes missing, but while she took care of that, Miles, being Spider-Man, would be able to do more than just that. This story has a grounded beginning, but it only gets more and more chaotic from this point on, and I promise you, you will believe me very soon. If you haven't already, be sure to drop a like on this video and subscribe for more amazing comic content. This is a new channel and we'd appreciate all the support we can get. From here, Miles would feel hopeless. Swinging around using his spider abilities, he had no idea how to find his father. The aid of S.H.I.E.L.D. would be a great idea, which was considered, but he had just been a part of a civil war against them. It was hard to believe they'd be willing to help after everything that had happened. And on top of that, he'd need to reveal his secret identity and who his father was. In the end though, nothing was more important than his father. So if it came down to it, Miles was willing to reveal everything. Shortly after this, like an angel coming to his rescue, a strange aircraft appeared above Miles, with its light shining on him. The savior was Maria Hill, the leader of S.H.I.E.L.D. To his surprise, she already knew that Miles Morales was Spider-Man, and she came to him regarding his missing father. Talk about convenient. Maria Hill would reveal that Jefferson Davis, a former agent of S.H.I.E.L.D., had rejoined them to protect Miles. She had needed a fresh face for a mission to purchase a very valuable piece of technology being sold. However, Jefferson had not been heard from since the beginning of the mission. S.H.I.E.L.D. has the ability to find anyone, hence how they found Miles. So in the words of Maria Hill, if she could not find Jefferson, that means he cannot be found. A bit grim, but here Miles would immediately lose all hope and conclude that his father must be dead somewhere then. Not the attitude you love to see in a hero, but hey, that explanation did make it sound like all hope was lost. Anyway, it would then be revealed that the technology being sold has the ability to transport its users between dimensions, something Miles was already familiar with. Maria Hill had another one of those devices here now, but the other was to be intercepted to avoid having it fall into the wrong hands. From here, she'd asked Miles to check other dimensions for his father. It had to be Miles because the initial mission for his father was unsanctioned. This was off the books. Of course, Miles would wonder why, and the answer would be that it was Maria Hill's fault the technology went missing to begin with. So this was a bit of a cleanup job being passed off to Miles. Spider-Man was of course not really interested in the politics of S.H.I.E.L.D. and instead would just prepare himself after hearing her reasoning. While Maria couldn't pinpoint exactly where Jefferson may be located, she was able to provide a likely guess as to which dimension he was likely in, and by now you can probably guess how Gwen comes into play. The portal would be opened, and before Spider-Man would head off, there would be a lighthearted moment where Maria would tell him not to later mention meeting a happily married version of herself if he were to find one. With that, we'd see a smile through Spider-Man's mask, and he would disappear into the portal as Maria looked on, hoping to find his father, and hey, maybe a wife. We know you're dying to see where Gwen makes an appearance. We're almost there. Upon exiting through the portal, Miles would immediately lose all confidence. He was in New York. It was home, like his New York, but different. It was the largest city in the world, and to find his father here felt like an impossible task. Nevertheless, Miles would begin swinging around, starting to search for places he might recognize from his dimension. As always with these stories, it didn't take long to run into problems. Pretty quickly, Miles would find this dimension's version of the Ringer, and just like the one from his dimension, this one was of course a villain. It wasn't done in the cleanest fashion, but Miles did manage to wrap up the fight pretty quickly. And just as it was finished, in the midst of what he considered the most important mission of his life, Spider-Gwen would appear. At this point, it's important to remember we're getting this story through Miles in the future telling his friends about the experience, and so there is frequent dialogue between them. Here, when Gwen is introduced, Miles, among other things, refers to Gwen as his future wife. Once united, the two would chill together and talk about everyday things such as real versus fake sugar while sharing drinks. Miles was basically trying not to face the problems in front of him, but Gwen would push him to talk about what was going on. He would take the bait and tell her that his father was missing. He'd give her the rundown on what had happened and explain the sad truth about why he couldn't couldn't help but check his phone. Despite it clearly not working in this dimension, Miles couldn't help but keep checking in hopes that a message from his father would come through. Miles was worried. What if this was something he couldn't fix? His emotions were pouring out, but he'd quickly bottle it up while pulling his mask back down over his face. As he did so, he would stand up and apologize for pouring out like that. He knew she had her own problems to handle, and so he could handle this one alone. After all, he's Spider-Man, and it would be from this point on that we could see just how close these two characters are. Gwen would grab hold of him and tell him to stop. She would comfort him and let him know that it's okay to feel like this. If anyone could understand, it would be her. She'd talk about her father sacrificing himself for her, then take off her mask and ask Miles to look at her. They were both spider folk, and that means a lot, but it doesn't mean they can't get scared. She would remind Miles of this, and the two would share a warm hug above the city lights. This warm moment would be interrupted by Miles' spidey senses going berserk, alerting him to the presence of a swarm of ninjas now surrounding them. The story was now beginning to spiral. While Gwen would try to calm him down, Miles was determined to get out of there and attempt to do so while simultaneously almost inadvertently killing Gwen. The two would end up face to face with the person behind this, Matt Murdock, otherwise known as Daredevil. He'd been listening to their conversation and would mention Miles' father, something Miles did not take lightly. The tough act wouldn't go far though, as Murdock would slash at him, unexpectedly leaving a wound. In the end, it seemed that in some way, Murdock was one of the people pulling the strings, and he'd give them a lead to find Jefferson Davis, a card reading Club Scorpion. This was not a favor though, really, as Matt Murdock would task them with bringing Jefferson's head. He was believed to be causing trouble for Silk, which in turn was affecting Murdock. Later that night, the two would be at Gwen's home, preparing to act on their lead. For a bit, the two would talk, and Miles would learn that on this Earth, Peter Parker was a normal guy who transformed into a lizard on prom night before dying in a fight against Spider-Woman. The two would show a genuine connection here and be able to relate in ways they couldn't with anyone else before leaving later that night for the mission. Because of his age and the location being a nightclub, Miles was left outside while Gwen went inside in search of Jefferson Davis. Inside the club, items would be auctioned, rare stuff too, like the Taskmaster's shield and Iron Man's Mark II armor. Pretty quickly, Gwen would be discovered by this Earth's Doc Ock, who would attack her with a squid to the face, as ridiculous as that might sound. But Miles would save her. There would be very little time to celebrate this though, as the action would continue, and Miles would very quickly, accidentally, find his father. This man, who appeared to be Miles' father, would take off Spider-Man's mask. And you might wonder, why would Miles let himself be unmasked so easily? But he would explain it by reasoning that this wasn't even his dimension, and on top of that, he wanted his father to see him for who he was and react to that. And well, there was a reaction, just not the one he'd hoped for. Upon seeing this face, Jefferson Davis would adjust his hat and then sucker punch Miles, sending him flying as Gwen watched. He'd pick up Miles, who was now bleeding, and make it very clear he had no idea who this boy was. Gwen would now strike at this man who seemed to be Jefferson Davis, and the goons in the club would begin firing their guns at her to protect their boss. This was nothing to Gwen. She creatively used her powers and cleared the room, and Miles, reflecting on this later, would remember that it made it very clear he had a long way to go with his own powers. Gwen was something else with hers. As she went to finish off the boss, he grabbed her leg and sent her up to the ceiling. Just when it looked like she was about to end the battle, she was electrocuted by a device on Jefferson's chest. This battle was very heated. The electrocution was somewhat of a reset on the fight, and things would continue. All the while, Miles was still calling this man Dad, because after all, it looked just like him. The fight would reach its climax when Miles was sent flying out the window, landing him outside. As he was ready to rejoin the fight, lights would begin flashing. It was the police telling him to put his hands in the air. Miles' first reaction would be to say that he could explain the situation. Except he couldn't, and with that, the next best thing would be to flee. As Miles sent his web strings above, the gun started firing. As Miles made his escape to the roof, Gwen would attempt to finish off Jefferson Davis, leaving him knocked down and tied up for the police. During this though, Miles was on the roof going through it. The situation was very overwhelming for him. It felt impossible to figure out all this, let alone fix it. Gwen would arrive shortly after and tell him it was time to go, but Miles couldn't. Despite how it looked, that was his father down there tied up and in the hands of the police. Speaking of the police, Jefferson would not be telling the police he'd kill them as he was being taken into custody. Not very cooperative. Gwen would explain that this was actually good, they could figure this out while Jefferson was in custody. Miles wasn't hearing this though and was going back to help his father while Gwen pleaded with him to stay. As he tried to leave, Gwen would shoot her web and force him to stay. She'd web Miles up and embrace him in an effort to comfort him. The police would interrupt this warm moment though. With Miles still wrapped in her webs, Gwen would hold him as the police came, pointing their guns and giving orders to take off their masks and put their hands in the air. Gwen would save the two again by activating the dimension transportation device Miles was still wearing from the beginning of the story. The two would disappear into the portal that opened on them, and they were safe now. Or so they hoped. They spawned in the middle of an invasion where giant spiders were being used to devastate everything nearby, and quickly they would teleport again to a new, hopefully safe location. They were now safe for a moment, but the device would begin to beep and signal Miles to return home. Determined to see this through to the end with him, Gwen decided to go with Miles and the two would teleport yet again. From here, Gwen and Miles teleport to the 616 universe where they found Silk agents already webbed up by 616's Peter. As they surveyed the crime scene, they discovered the agents were in the process of stealing batteries, but Gwen couldn't figure out what for. Suddenly, the captured criminals would disappear, leaving Miles and Gwen with little to no answers. The two would then catch a bite nearby on a roof. They were able to conclude that Silk had duplicated Gwen's dimension device and that the batteries were for use with that and other technologies. They continued to piece together what was going on, and it was here that Miles expressed his appreciation and gave some affection to Gwen. You see a glitter in his eye as they talk about each other, but we skip to one of the goons back with the villain Jefferson Davis, who sees that they'd failed. He kicks the goon back into the field to complete the mission he was originally given. We then skip back to Miles and Gwen, who are met with the appearance of Miss Marvel. It's here that she agrees to help Miles and Gwen on their mission. Gwen and Kamala have a heart-to-heart as more Silk agents attack the trio. And as the battle ends, Gwen and Kamala jump into a portal after Miles recklessly jumps into another portal to potentially face off against Jefferson. Issue 14 of Spider-Man 2016 is where things get really interesting with Miles and Gwen. Gwen would exit the portal and land back in her dimension where she would find no sign of Miles nor the enemy. Now a bit desperate, Gwen would attempt to communicate with the person on the other side of the dimension teleportation device that has seemingly been trying to help them thus far. This was to no avail for a bit, but Gwen would continue to probe until finally there was a ding from the device. These dings would become a method of communication with the person on the other side of the device. The device and mysterious person behind it would ping a certain direction for Gwen to go in, and she would do so while questioning if this person had previously gotten in trouble for helping out, to which they would signal yes. While Gwen followed this lead, we'd go back to Miles, who had followed a criminal through dimensions in hope of finding his father, and it would work. Miles was now face to face with his father, Scorpion. Miles would attempt to talk with this version of Jefferson Davis, who would have no interest in that, leading to a fight yet again. Just in time though, Gwen would enter through a portal and strike before this fight with Miles really could begin. The armed lackeys of Jefferson Davis would make a terrible decision and begin shooting at Gwen and Miles, missing and hitting the open portal. This would cause everything to go haywire. Miles would lose Gwen and she went spiraling into the portal. She was out of reach and gone. Soon after, he too would go spiraling and believed he was done for. The two were lucky though, and would reunite on the other side where they would hug and embrace each other now with no idea where they were. It turned out to be the dimension of Spider-Man Neuer, but that reunion was short-lived. The two would again get sucked into a portal and hold each other tightly with hopes that they would end up together on the other side. Gwen and Miles would end up teleporting a few more times to different dimensions. The Watch was out of control now. They would even end up in a world where there were zombie versions of villains like the Green Goblin and Doc Ock. They would hold each other and teleport again, although this time, Gwen would find herself alone on the other side. In a few seconds, she would see it. A massive billboard reading Happy Anniversary to the Amazing Spider-Man and the Spectacular Spider-Woman on their 20 years of spider bliss. With it, a poster of the two dressed in spider-themed wedding attire. They were married in this dimension. As for Miles, he'd end up back where the madness had started. As he walked around though, his spider senses went off and alerted him to a threat. Miles would immediately begin attacking. It again seemed like the Scorpion, but this time, the man with the face of his father was in fact really his father. We were now at the conclusion of the sitting in a tree storyline, but believe it or not, this only gets crazier. While Miles had found his father, Gwen was on Earth 8 face to face with Peter Porker. After clearing the misunderstanding and apologizing for just punching his father, Miles would hug him. They were finally reunited. It was revealed it was Jefferson communicating through the Watch. He'd stolen his from a Silk lab and hacked it. With the AI's help, it was possible to help Miles. After finding his father, Miles was ready to go home where they'd be safe, but Jefferson wasn't finished with this dimension hopping. Silk was dangerously close to mastering interdimensional transportation, and while that may seem like none of their business, it mattered to Jefferson because the Scorpion had his face and name, and on top of that, if they didn't stop him, no one would be safe anywhere. It was decided the two would work together like Rick and Morty to save the dimensions. Back on Earth 8, Gwen would meet the children of her and Miles. This was crazy to her and of course us, the readers. But yeah, in this dimension, Gwen and Miles had children and were married. Interestingly enough, one was named George Jefferson. This dimension's Miles and Gwen were off on a second honeymoon, so with that, we avoided a more awkward meeting. Peter Porker would attempt to rush Gwen away through a portal, but she would ask for help. Peter would be uninterested in this. In his mind, these speeches were like a trademark for the different Gwens. His dimension has already been through what Gwen was experiencing now, and so he didn't exactly want to go through with that again. The kids would help change the mood though. This was like their mom in danger after all. And so, begrudgingly, Peter would agree to help. Back on Earth 65, Miles and his father were face to face with the Scorpion and all his associates. This was the endgame. There was some pretty strong dialogue here from the Scorpion because he would literally threaten to rip off Jefferson's face and wear it like a mask. Not only that, but he said he would strangle every single version of the Morales family in their cribs. Pretty insane. But as his villain speech went on, a familiar voice could be heard. It was Gwen, and like we've seen a couple times throughout the storyline, she'd again make a great entrance and knock down the Scorpion, and immediately she'd have Miles smash his dimension transporting watch. A great play, but it was far from over. They were too late. Negotiations with the first of these Silk Sister agencies were finished days ago, and the first rank of Interdimensional Guerrilla Strike Force were here to fight. All this would be interrupted because the associates were met by Spider-Ham, who they mistakenly called Spider-Pig, which I'm sure you've done before as well. They tell him to get out of their way and make reference to the three little pigs, but Spider-Ham would play into this and call in the big bad wolf, a squad of fellow Spider-Folk here to help out. Miles had no idea who these people were, but Gwen couldn't begin to explain. On this team were their kids from another dimension. Spider-Girl and Spider-Boy would begin fighting the Scorpion, who had their grandfather's face. They'd throw the Scorpion towards Miles and call him Dad, but Miles' own father would take charge and open a portal transporting the Scorpion away from their fight. He'd be teleported to a place where he'd be best dealt with. It's unclear where this was, but Scorpion would now be face to face with what seems like another version of Jefferson Davis, who would make it clear that here Arbiter Rio is law. The situation was dealt with, and now Gwen would explain that those were their kids, at least on Earth 8. Along with them were Jessica's child, a Craven, and Penny Parker. They had a lot to take in, and Miles would lean into Gwen and admit he hardly knows her, and something very big would happen next. He couldn't help but wonder how they go from where they are now to a future where they have kids and are married. The two would kiss, but Gwen would quickly back away. She was for this, but the timing was too fast. There was too much happening all at once. This relationship was what worked in another dimension, but they would have their own story. They would write it in their own way, and the two would agree to just be friends for now. With that said, what comics should we cover next? Until next time, keep that plot around you. I'm KJ. Have a great day. Goodbye.